On a quiet autumn evening in Savannah, Georgia, the grand Gracewood estate stood silent beneath a canopy of fading orange leaves. The air was thick with the scent of rain and old memories. Inside that mansion, built of marble, oak, and family secrets, sat Eleanor Grace, 72 years old, alone in a room that once echoed with laughter. Her trembling fingers traced the rim of a porcelain teacup as she stared at the portrait on the wall. A smiling young man in a suit, her only son, William. The years had turned that smile into something distant. The boy she had raised with pride and affection had grown into a man she barely recognized. A man who called only when money was short and love was convenient. The old clock on the wall ticked, loud and steady, filling the hollow silence that stretched across the drawing room. It was the same clock her late husband, Charles Grace, had wound every evening, a small ritual that once symbolized order and constancy. Since his passing, the sound now reminded her of time slipping away. The wealth surrounding her was a cruel reminder of what it had cost. Every chandelier, every antique mirror, every acre of their pecan fields outside had been bought through years of sacrifice, years that slowly traded warmth for prosperity. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, dusk painted the estate in shades of amber and blue. The servants had long gone home, leaving her with the rustling of the wind through the magnolia trees. In that loneliness, a thought had begun to grow, faint at first, then sharper with every heartbeat. For months, Eleanor had felt something gnawing at her soul, a cold realization that her own son's heart had turned to stone. The last time William visited, he spoke little of family and much of business. He had asked casually, too casually, about the deed to the family land. "It would be smart to move things around now before you get too tired to manage all this," he'd said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, Eleanor had cried herself to sleep, not for his words, but for what they revealed. The love she once believed was unbreakable had become transactional. Now, sitting in that empty mansion, the moonlight brushing against her pale face, she whispered into the silence, "What happened to us, Will?" There was no answer, only the creaking of the wooden floorboards, like an old house breathing with her sorrow. Eleanor's mind began to wander back to the early years, when Gracewood was still just an idea. She remembered standing beside Charles on the very land that now stretched miles across the Georgia countryside. "We'll build something that lasts longer than we do," he had told her, gripping her hand. They had nothing then, only ambition, faith, and a love that could outshine poverty. They worked through storms and droughts, through debts and late nights. Slowly, piece by piece, they built an empire, but in their climb to the top, they missed the small, fleeting moments. The birthdays, the laughter, the warmth of a child's hug. William grew up surrounded by wealth but starved of affection. And when he finally found his place in the world, among businessmen and opportunists, he learned a cruel lesson. Love could be bought, and loyalty was just another transaction. Now, at 41 he was successful, respected, and utterly hollow. Eleanor reached for a letter that lay unopened on the table. The envelope bore her son's handwriting, neat and deliberate. She already knew what it said. He wanted to discuss the future of Gracewood. The future, that was his word for inheritance. Her heart trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She had spent years hoping that kindness, or perhaps age, might soften him. But time had done nothing of the sort. As thunder rumbled outside, Eleanor stood and walked toward the grand staircase, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor. Each step echoed through the mansion, carrying the weight of her years and the heaviness of her heart. She paused midway up, glancing toward the portrait again. In the flickering light, William's painted eyes seemed to follow her, the same blue as her own, but colder now. By the time she reached her bedroom, a strange calm had settled over her. She sat at her desk, opened her diary, and began to write. Her pen moved slowly, each word deliberate. If love can't be measured by words, then perhaps it can be tested by loss. She stopped, reading the line over and over. For the first time, the idea didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. If William still had any love left, he would prove it. And if he didn't, then the truth would finally be set free. Eleanor closed the diary, her frail fingers pressing the cover shut. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the room. Outside, rain began to fall. Slow, steady, cleansing. It was the kind of rain that washed away the dust of the past. She took one last look at the portrait of her husband on the wall and whispered, "Forgive me, Charles, but I have to know." That night, as lightning flashed beyond the windows and thunder rolled through the valley, Eleanor Grace made the decision that would change everything. She would fake her own illness. And in doing so, she would uncover the one truth that money, power, and time had always hidden, whether her son ever truly loved her. When Eleanor closed her diary, the house seemed to hold its breath. The portrait on the wall stared back, a patient witness to a lifetime of choices and their quiet costs. She leaned back in her chair and let her mind drift, not into the present gloom, but into the warm, brighter years when William was still a child, and the future felt like a promise rather than a negotiation. William had not always been this distant man in a tailored suit. Once he was a small boy with knees perpetually stained with dirt, a mop of hair that refused to stay neat, and a laugh that filled the hallways like sunlight. Eleanor remembered him chasing lightning bugs across the pecan groves, breathless with the kind of joy only children know. Those were the nights the mansion felt alive, not because of the chandeliers or the fine silver, but because of a child's careless happiness. Charles and Eleanor worked hard to give their son a life they never had. They wanted him to have opportunity, education, and comfort, the things they had been denied. So they labored, saving every penny and making sacrifices that were invisible to everyone but each other. Those sacrifices built Gracewood, brick by brick, acre by acre. Yet, like many bargains made for the future, those choices came with a price the couple hadn't fully understood. As the business grew, so did the demands on their time. Meetings that ran late into the night became more common than bedtime stories. Charles took trips to Atlanta to negotiate deals, and Eleanor spent long afternoons juggling ledgers and guest lists. Love, when measured in hours, was slowly replaced by calendars full of obligations. William learned to navigate that absence. He learned to fill the empty spaces with other things: the city's bright lights, new friends, and later, the intoxicating confidence of success. Eleanor could still see it all in her mind, the day William turned 16. She had planned everything: a small party with his childhood friends, his favorite peach pie, a ribboned bicycle lying hidden in the parlor. She had stayed up late polishing silverware and rehearsing the speech she would give, trying to balance pride with a mother's tender scolding. The house smelled of cinnamon and sugar. The air hummed with the quiet excitement of surprise. When the doorbell rang, her heart leaped. Children's voices, muffled laughter. This would be a perfect memory. Yet the laughter that evening never filled the dining room. William did not come. The hours stretched. She sat with a candlelit cake growing colder while the clock hand crawled toward midnight. Finally, the phone rang. William's voice, when it came through, was curt and distracted. "Mom, I'm with some people from the city. I'll stop by later," he had said, without apology, without the slightest regret for the empty chair at his own birthday. Eleanor waited until morning. The bicycle remained in the parlor, and the pie hardened at the edge. She told herself it was a teenage lapse, that he'd bounce back. But the pattern slipped in quietly: missed holidays, brief calls that focused on investments rather than feelings, his absence explained away by work or opportunities. Each missed moment was a small fissure. Each excuse widened the crack between mother and son. When William left for college, the distance grew formal. Letters arrived less often. When he returned during breaks, conversations were punctuated by talk of stocks and deals, as if affection had been replaced by balance sheets. Charles and Eleanor tried to steer their son toward values they'd hoped would outlast success: humility, gratitude, and a sense of belonging. But the lessons of the boardroom proved louder than the lessons of the home. Then, one autumn evening, when the magnolias trembled and dusk wrapped the fields in a blue haze, Charles fell ill. He had been the family's anchor, the sturdy hand that steadied even the worst storms. Eleanor watched him become smaller in the hospital bed, and the business meetings grew frantic around them. It was during those fevered days and sleepless nights that William's priorities were exposed for everyone to see. At the funeral, the house was full of acquaintances, partners, and men who nodded with calculated sympathy. William stood near the back, impeccably dressed, his expression composed in a way that suggested he knew how to present grief without being undone by it. He spoke of his father in measured phrases, carefully chosen and well delivered. Afterwards, when the crowd had thinned, Eleanor believed a son's sorrow would surface. She hoped for the private hand on her shoulder, the one person who would say, "Mother will get through this." Instead, William's first question was about the estate. "Have the property assessments been done? We should consider restructuring." The words landed like winter frost. In their wake came the realization that what had been a man of flesh and memory had become a man who thought in margins and profit projections. Eleanor tried not to blame the child he had once been. She understood, in part, that ambition could be a lonely teacher. But understanding did not heal the sting. Where she wanted a son's comfort, she found only a stakeholder's curiosity. The house that had once echoed with family lore became a room filled with files and calculated glances. The pecan groves, once a place for childhood games, were now models for development proposals. As the years rolled on, William's visits became even rarer. Telephone calls addressed logistics. Holidays became brief appointments on a crowded calendar. Eleanor watched him from the drawing room window sometimes, a figure slipping into a sleek car, a silhouette swallowed by the city's lights. The love she had poured into him felt like a currency spent without return. And still, in the quiet hours, she clung to memories. The way he used to hide under her skirts, the mess of crayons on his hands, the time he built a crooked fort from old quilts and declared it a castle. Those tender shards of the past were not enough to erase the present, but they kept a fragile hope alive. Hope that a man shaped by years of guidance could remember what it felt like to belong. Now, as Eleanor sat alone with the portrait on the wall, she understood that the boy she had raised was gone. In his place stood a man who measured the world in ledgers and diagrams, whose compass pointed toward profit and not people. The realization was a slow grief, not the sudden wrench of loss, but the steady erosion of a daughterless mother's expectations. Yet even in that grief, something else had started to harden inside her, a resolve. If William's love had been traded for gain, she thought, then she would find out the price of that bargain. Not with anger, she decided, but with clarity. She would uncover the truth of what mattered to him. And in doing so, she would decide what mattered to her. Keep watching. Because sometimes the road to justice begins with remembering what was lost. The morning after her decision, Eleanor Grace woke before dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glistening. The air outside the mansion smelled of wet earth and magnolia blossoms, but inside, in her chest, there was still a heaviness that clung to her ribs. Not of sorrow this time, but of resolve. She sat by her window, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching sunlight crawl across the misty pecan fields. The land was beautiful, patient, and loyal, everything her son was not. For years, it had kept her company when people drifted away, and now it would become her ally in the plan forming quietly in her mind. It had started as a whisper the night before, a strange, unsettling thought that refused to leave her. What if I pretended to be dying? The question had frightened her at first. It felt manipulative, dramatic, a sin in its own right. But the more she turned it over, the more it made sense. Love could be faked easily with words. But compassion could only be measured by sacrifice. She wanted to know what her son would sacrifice for her. Eleanor rose from her chair and made her way down the staircase, her cane tapping a rhythm that echoed softly through the mansion's marble halls. The morning light caught the edges of framed photographs. Her husband's first truck, her son's first horse, the groundbreaking of Gracewood's mill. Every photo was a testament to hard work, legacy, and devotion. Yet, none of it showed what had been lost in the process. In the kitchen, Clara, her oldest friend and housekeeper, was already making coffee. She was a short woman with silver hair and eyes that could see straight through pretense. Clara had been by Eleanor's side since William was born, had rocked him as a baby, scolded him as a boy, and quietly mourned the distance that grew with the years. "You're up early again," Clara said, glancing over her shoulder. "Didn't sleep much?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, but I've been thinking." She hesitated, fingers tightening around her cane. "Clara, if I were to fall ill, how long do you think it would take before William came to see me?" Clara frowned, her stirring spoon freezing midair. "That's not a kind question, Miss Eleanor." "Maybe not," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "But I need to know the answer." Clara set the spoon down slowly. "You don't mean you're gonna—" "I do," Eleanor interrupted. "Not truly sick, of course, just enough to make him believe I am, enough to see what he does when he thinks I haven't much time left." Clara's eyes widened. "That's a dangerous game." Eleanor gave a faint smile. "It's not a game. It's truth, wearing a disguise." For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle simmer of the coffee pot. Then Clara sighed. "And if he comes running, if he breaks his back trying to be here?" "What then?" Eleanor looked out the window, her eyes fixed on the grove. "Then I'll know there's still something left to love." She didn't tell Clara the rest. That the plan was not just about testing love, but about preparing justice. Over the years, William had made subtle moves, manipulating property papers, convincing her to transfer managerial rights, pressing her to sign routine documents. Eleanor had pretended not to notice, but every signature she avoided, every document she locked away, was another stitch in her safety net. Now, she would see how deep his greed truly went. That afternoon, she drove into town, slowly, carefully, and to visit Dr. Harris, the family physician. The man had known her since her 30s and trusted her judgment more than most of his patients. "Eleanor," he said with a chuckle as she entered, "you look far too healthy to be visiting me." She smiled politely. "That's good to hear, but I need a favor, a rather unusual one." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I need you to tell my son that I'm not doing well," she said, her voice even. "Nothing specific, just that age has finally caught up to me." He blinked. "You want me to lie?" "Not lie," she said gently, "just let time sound heavier than it is." The doctor studied her for a moment, concern knitting his brow. "You sure this is wise?" "I'm not asking for your opinion, only your discretion," she replied. "And I'll pay whatever fee you think appropriate." He shook his head. "Eleanor, you've paid enough in this life. I'll do what I can. But whatever you're planning, be careful." She left the clinic with a folded note in her purse, a mock-up of a medical summary she'd asked him to draft. It mentioned declining strength, heart irregularities, and recommended rest. Nothing severe, but enough to stir worry in a son who still had a conscience. That evening, she mailed a letter to William, her handwriting shaky and frail by design. It read, "My dearest William, I hope this finds you well. I have not been feeling myself lately, and the doctor says I ought to rest. The estate has become too large for me to manage alone. It might be time to talk about the future. Before it's too late. Love, Mother." When she sealed the envelope, her hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the quiet thrill of uncertainty. For the first time in years, she was not a helpless mother waiting to be forgotten. She was a strategist, reclaiming the narrative. Later that night, Clara found her by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "You really sent it, didn't you?" Eleanor nodded. "Then I hope you're ready for whatever truth comes back," Clara said softly. Eleanor didn't answer. She knew that once William received the letter, events would move swiftly. He'd either rush to her side with concern or with calculation. Either way, she would be ready. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the magnolias. The mansion seemed to hum with energy, a dormant story stirring awake. As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor whispered to herself, "Let the truth begin." Because sometimes, the only way to expose a lie is to live one first. 3 days later, the letter reached Atlanta. And less than 24 hours after that, the gates of Gracewood creaked open to the low growl of a black Mercedes. Eleanor heard the sound before she saw the car. The steady hum of an expensive engine didn't belong on that gravel path anymore. Not since Charles had passed. She sat still in her armchair, pretending to read the same page of an old gardening magazine. Inside, her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the strange, sharp ache of anticipation. Through the lace curtains, she saw him step out. William Grace, her son, 41, polished to perfection. A crisp navy suit, gold cufflinks that caught the sunlight, and a face untouched by worry or love. He looked like success molded into flesh, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor wondered if that was her fault. He stood there for a moment, surveying the estate as though it were a business he'd once invested in, now checking its returns. When his gaze swept toward the window, she quickly looked down, feigning distraction. Clara appeared in the doorway. "He's here," she whispered, her voice half relief, half warning. "I heard," Eleanor murmured. "Bring in some tea. Make it fresh. He'll expect it to be perfect." Moments later, the heavy wooden doors opened, and William walked in. His cologne filled the air, expensive, unfamiliar, and cold. "Mother," he said smoothly, spreading his arms just wide enough to look affectionate. "You look, well, considering," Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's what the doctor says, too." He kissed her cheek, his lips barely touching skin. "You should have told me sooner you weren't feeling well." "I came as fast as I could, as fast as you could," she thought. 3 days later, but she only nodded. "It's been difficult keeping up with things. I didn't want to worry you." He placed his briefcase on the side table, the gesture businesslike, deliberate. "I'm glad you did," he said, glancing around the room. "The house looks old. You should really think about modernizing. New staff. Maybe sell off the East Field. You don't need all that land anymore." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. "That land is your father's legacy." William smiled, polite but dismissive. "And legacies can evolve, Mother. Nothing lasts forever. Not houses, not land. You've taught me that." She gave a small, measured laugh. "I don't remember teaching you that lesson." He waved off the remark and leaned back. "How's your health, really? The letter worried me." Eleanor sighed, letting her shoulders slump slightly. "The doctor says I need rest. My heart's weaker these days." William's face softened, or rather, performed the act of softening. You should have called me sooner. I didn't want to be a burden. He reached over, patted her hand. You could never be that. Then in the same breath, but maybe it's time we think about the estate's future, just in case something happens. The transition was seamless. Pity to paperwork, tenderness to transaction. Eleanor almost admired his precision. Almost. I suppose you're right, she said quietly, masking her disgust with vulnerability. It's too much for me now. I can take care of it all, he said quickly. The business, the land, even the trust funds. You just rest. I'll handle the rest. Eleanor looked at him, really looked. There was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation. He was the same boy who once cried over a broken toy, now grown into a man who'd trade anything for power, even blood. How is business, William? She asked softly. He perked up. Good, we're expanding. Real estate, mostly. A few partnerships in Florida and Texas. The right kind of investors. Old money, like ours. Like yours, she corrected. He chuckled. Well, like ours for now. The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. When Clara entered with tea, William gave her a nod but didn't look her in the eye. Servants were invisible in his world, always had been. She poured quietly, and Eleanor noticed how William's gaze followed the silver teapot more than the woman holding it. Even here he saw objects, not people. So, he said after a sip, have you thought about your will? Eleanor smiled gently. Why do you ask? Because it's important, Mother, he replied quickly. You have so much to organize, and you wouldn't want to leave a mess behind. I could help you structure it, make sure everything is protected. Protected. A polite word for owned. She gave a small nod. Yes, I'll think about that. But not today. Today, I just want to enjoy your company. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sentiment. Of course, whatever you'd like. They talked, or rather she spoke while he half listened. He asked about accounts, taxes, field productivity. She spoke of memories, gardens, neighbors. Their conversations no longer spoke the same language. That night, after dinner, William excused himself to make some calls. Eleanor watched him step onto the veranda, phone pressed to his ear, voice low. Through the glass, she caught pieces of his words. Transfer rights. Valuation next quarter. Liquidate the orchard first. It was exactly as she expected. The son she once cradled had come home not to comfort her, but to claim what he thought was his. When he re-entered, his smile returned, charming, rehearsed. You should rest, Mother. I'll stay a few days. We can talk about everything properly, she nodded serene. That would be nice. But as he turned away, she whispered to herself, Yes, let's talk about everything. That night, Eleanor opened her diary again. Her handwriting trembled slightly, but her thoughts were sharp. He came. Not for love, but for legacy. The illness is working, but I must play this role perfectly, until he reveals himself entirely. The candlelight flickered across her face as she added one final line. If truth hides in shadows, then I must become the darkness that exposes it. Down the hall, William was still on the phone, his voice steady, confident, certain that the old woman would not see through him. But Gracewood had always belonged to Eleanor Grace, and what she was about to do next would remind him why. The next evening, Gracewood Mansion shimmered under a golden sunset. The wide halls smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon polish. Clara had made sure of that. The table in the dining room gleamed with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Eleanor insisted on it herself. If my son is staying for dinner, she'd said with a wry smile, then the house should remember how to shine. But this dinner wasn't about elegance. It was about truth. As the final candle was lit, Eleanor glanced across the long oak table. In the old days it was crowded. Family, neighbors, laughter, Charles at the head, and William making faces to make her laugh during grace. Now there were only 3 chairs, hers, William's, and one for Clara, who hovered quietly at the edge of the room, pretending to adjust things that didn't need fixing. When William entered, he looked the part of the dutiful son. Suit pressed, sleeves rolled, smile perfectly measured. "You went all out, Mother," he said, pulling out his chair. "Looks like the old days." Eleanor nodded. "I thought it might remind us both of something good." He grinned, pouring himself a glass of wine before she could offer. "You always did have a flair for presentation." She folded her napkin neatly, her voice calm. "Presentation matters. It's how we tell the world who we are." He didn't notice the double meaning. For a while, the conversation was harmless. Talk of the weather, the new bypass road being built nearby, local gossip. But Eleanor noticed something. Every time she steered the talk toward feelings, William steered it back to finances. When she mentioned how lonely the house had become, he said, "You could rent part of it out. It's prime land." When she spoke of her garden, he asked, "How much do you spend maintaining it?" When she brought up the old church fundraiser, he asked, "Do you still donate? Because you really shouldn't in your condition." It was a polite interrogation, gentle on the surface, sharp underneath. At one point, Clara brought in the main course, roasted chicken with buttered beans, the same meal Charles used to love. William barely touched it, distracted by his own reflection in the wineglass. "You remember when your father used to carve the chicken?" Eleanor asked softly. William smirked. He was always so precise, like cutting a deal instead of a dinner. "That's one way to see it," she said. "I used to think it was care, that every slice meant something." He shrugged. "We all have our ways of showing care." Eleanor looked directly at him. "And how do you show yours?" He froze for a second, then gave a short laugh. "By being here, of course. What more do you want?" Her gaze lingered. "I suppose time will tell." The silence that followed was heavy. Even the clock seemed to pause between ticks. Finally, William leaned back. "Mother, we should really talk about what happens if your health declines further. I'm not trying to rush you, but preparation is important." Eleanor's tone stayed even. "You sound just like your father." He smiled, proud. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It isn't one." He blinked. "Excuse me?" She sighed. "Your father prepared for everything, except what truly mattered. He left this world with a perfect business plan but an empty home. Don't repeat his mistake." William looked away, annoyed. "You always make things emotional." "Because they are," she whispered. For a moment, the conversation hung between them, raw and fragile. Then William cleared his throat, changing the subject. "Anyway, I've been looking at the Eastern Grove. If we clear it and bring in developers—" Eleanor interrupted softly. "That grove has graves beneath it." He frowned. "What?" "Old family graves," she said. "Your great-grandfather, and his before him. You'd be building over their bones." William smirked. "Well, that's just sentiment, Mother. History doesn't pay taxes." Her eyes darkened, the firelight flickering in them. Some things are worth more than money. He poured another glass of wine, oblivious to how her words cut through the air like glass. If you say so. But times are changing. Eleanor sat back, watching him. Every movement of his hand, every glance, every false smile. She studied him the way a chess master studies her opponent's openings. He had come to win. But so had she. After dessert, Clara excused herself. William loosened his tie, leaning forward. You know, he said casually, you could sign a temporary transfer of management, just until you're better. It'd make things smoother. Banks, investors, legal stuff. Eleanor tilted her head. A temporary transfer? Yes. Purely administrative. You'd still have ownership, of course. She gave a faint smile. How thoughtful. I just want to help. You always did, she murmured. Then she reached across the table and placed her frail hand over his. For a brief moment, it almost felt real, the contact between a mother and her son. But underneath the softness, she was testing the waters. His hand stayed limp, unreciprocated. You should get some rest, he said, withdrawing. We'll talk paperwork tomorrow. As he stood to leave, she said quietly, William. He turned. When you were 10, you told me you wanted to build a bridge. Do you remember? He frowned. A bridge? Yes, she said, smiling faintly. You said you wanted to build one between our house and the world, so no one would ever feel alone. He looked uncomfortable. That was a long time ago. Yes, she whispered. It was. When he was gone, Eleanor sat alone at the table. The candles had burned down to stubs, wax dripping like tears across the silver holders. The air was still warm, but she felt cold. She reached for her diary again and wrote, The bridge he dreamed of has crumbled. Tomorrow I'll see how far the ruins go. Then she added another line beneath it. Clara will place a recorder under the table for tomorrow's conversation. If he means to steal my life's work, I'll have proof of his intent. She closed the book gently, her heart calm now. The dinner had given her all she needed, not comfort, but confirmation. Eleanor Grace blew out the last candle and whispered to the darkness, Now the real test begins. The following morning, the air around Gracewood felt different. Still, heavy, like the calm before another storm. A mist hung low across the pecan fields, softening the edges of the world. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and polished wood. Eleanor sat in her armchair near the parlor window, pretending to read the morning paper while her mind replayed every word from the night before. William's polite insistence, his careful tone, the suggestion of a temporary transfer. It had all been too practiced, too smooth. She'd seen men like that before, her husband's old partners, the ones who could smile while signing away another man's dream. William had learned from the best, but what he didn't know was that she had learned too. At 11 o'clock, sharp, William came downstairs dressed impeccably, phone in hand, eyes already busy with messages. "Morning, Mother," he said, barely looking up. "Morning, dear," she replied sweetly. "Coffee?" He waved his free hand. "Later. I've got to make a quick call. Business can't wait, even out here." Eleanor smiled gently. "Of course not. You go ahead." She waited until he stepped into the library, his favorite room because it had the best cell signal. The walls were thick oak, but old houses had thin secrets. A small vent above the parlor led directly into the library's far corner. And through that vent, words sometimes carried. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, pretending to nap. It began softly, the low murmur of William's voice, then the rhythm of a salesman, smooth, confident, certain. "Yeah, I'm here now," he was saying. "The old woman looks weaker than ever. Shouldn't be long before she signs." Eleanor's grip tightened on her cane. "She doesn't suspect a thing," he continued. "I'll tell her it's just paperwork for the trust. Once it's in my name, we can move fast. The East Grove alone could fetch millions in development bids. The mansion, that'll go to auction. Too much upkeep for one person." There was a pause. Then he laughed. That same sharp, hollow laugh she remembered from his youth when he'd gotten away with a lie. "No, she won't fight it. She thinks I care. I've played the dutiful son long enough." The sound that escaped Eleanor wasn't a sob, but something quieter, the exhale of realization, a truth she had already suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud made it heavier, crueler. Through the vent came another voice, muffled, male. "And what about the will?" "She'll leave it all to me," William said confidently. "I'll make sure of it, even if I have to get the lawyer to draft it myself." Eleanor's heart thudded. The air around her seemed to vanish. Outside, a mockingbird sang from a branch, oblivious to the betrayal echoing through the old walls. William's tone shifted to business. "Once everything's settled, I'll call you. Just have the papers ready. I'll need to move some money through the company first. Make it look legitimate." Eleanor couldn't listen anymore. Her hands shook as she reached for the teacup beside her, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness. For a moment she thought she might faint. Clara appeared quietly in the doorway, sensing something wrong. "Miss Eleanor? You all right?" Eleanor blinked hard, forcing herself steady. "Clara," she whispered, "I need you to come here." The older woman hurried over, her eyes narrowing. "You look pale as chalk." Eleanor's voice trembled, but her words were sharp. "He's trying to take everything. Every last acre." Clara's expression hardened. "You heard him?" "Every word." Clara clenched her fists. "I'll wring that boy's neck myself." "No," Eleanor said firmly, gripping her friend's arm. "We won't confront him. Not yet." "Then what?" Eleanor's eyes, though damp, gleamed with steel. "We'll let him finish digging his own grave." Later that day, William approached her with his polished smile. "Mother," he began, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should visit Mr. Porter. You remember Father's old lawyer? He could help sort the paperwork while I'm still here." Eleanor tilted her head. "That's thoughtful, William." He smiled. "Just trying to make things easier for you." "Oh, you already are," she said softly. "More than you know." He didn't catch the edge in her voice. He never did. That evening, while William went to meet a potential investor in town, Eleanor and Clara sat by the fireplace. The silence between them was heavy but purposeful. "What now?" Clara asked finally. Eleanor gazed into the flames. "Now," she said, "we prepare." "For what?" "For the moment he thinks he's won." She took out her diary again and began to write. "Greed is a disease that blinds before it kills. William has forgotten that the soil he covets was watered by our blood, not his ambition. If he believes I am frail, let him. The weaker he thinks I am, the stronger my truth will become." Clara poured her a cup of tea. "You sure you want to go through with this? It's risky, playing this close to fire." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Sometimes you have to burn a bridge to see who was really crossing it with you." When William returned late that night, the house was quiet. He thought his mother had gone to bed. But as he passed her door, he saw a thin line of light spilling from beneath it. Inside, Eleanor sat at her desk, her hands folded neatly atop an envelope addressed to Mr. Henry Porter, attorney at law. She smiled faintly at the sound of his footsteps outside, a mother's instinct that could still recognize her son's walk after all these years. He paused at the door, listening. Then, with a satisfied hum, he continued down the hall toward his room. Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded. Then she whispered to herself, "So that's what love looks like, when it dies quietly." She sealed the envelope, pressed her family's wax crest into it, and placed it on the desk. Tomorrow, that letter would set everything in motion. The plan that would ensure Grace Wood remained untouched by greed, even if it meant breaking her own heart. As she blew out the lamp, the house plunged into silence again. Outside, the night, wind carried the scent of magnolia and the soft cry of a lone bird. It sounded almost like morning. But inside Eleanor Grace's chest, the morning was over. Now came justice. The next morning dawned pale and cool, with a thin veil of mist still resting over the pecan trees. Grace Wood looked calm, deceptively calm, as though the very walls were unaware of the storm about to unfold within them. Eleanor Grace, however, was wide awake, already dressed in her best navy coat. Her cane tapped softly against the marble floor as she descended the stairs, each step measured, deliberate, and steady. Clara followed behind, holding a leather satchel filled with papers. "Are you sure you don't want me to come inside with you?" she asked. Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, Clara, this part I must do alone. If he's planning to take everything from me, I'll be the one to make sure he leaves with nothing but guilt." Outside, the car waited, an old Lincoln that smelled faintly of thyme and tobacco. It carried her through town, past the church where Charles was buried, past the courthouse square, and finally to a small brick building with a brass plaque on the door. Henry Porter. Attorney at law Mr. Porter was already waiting, a man in his late 60s with tired eyes and the calm patience of someone who had seen too much of both greed and grief. He stood as she entered. "Eleanor," he said kindly, shaking her hand. "I wasn't expecting you, but Clara's call told me it was important." "It is," she said, lowering herself into a chair. "I'm afraid I need to rewrite my will." He blinked, surprised. "Again?" The last version was quite generous to William. "That was before I learned what generosity means," she replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. Mr. Porter studied her face for a long moment. "I take it there's been trouble?" Eleanor nodded. "He plans to sell the land, the house, everything Charles and I built. He'll smile while he does it, and he'll call it progress. I can't stop him with affection, so I'll stop him with law." Porter leaned back. "And what do you have in mind?" Eleanor took a slow breath. "Gracewood is not just a home, it's a legacy. I want to create a foundation. The Gracewood Community Trust, the mansion, the groves, the funds, all transferred to it. It will run as a charitable organization for education and preservation. Scholarships for children of farmers, maintenance of the land, restoration of the church and cemetery. Everything will serve this community as Charles once dreamed." Mr. Porter raised an eyebrow. "And William?" "He'll receive what he deserves," she said. "Enough to keep the will uncontested, but not enough to undo it. I want his inheritance to be symbolic, a reminder of what he valued most." "What symbol did you have in mind?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Money, of course. $1 for every acre of land he tried to steal. Porter couldn't help but chuckle softly. You haven't lost your touch. Eleanor's gaze hardened. No, Henry. I've just learned where to use it. For the next hour, they worked through documents, trust deeds, stipulations, and signatures. Every pen stroke felt like a reclamation of dignity, every paragraph a defense against betrayal. When she was done, Porter looked at the papers with quiet admiration. You understand, Eleanor, he said, that once this is executed, there's no taking it back. Gracewood will no longer belong to your family name. Eleanor looked toward the window, where sunlight filtered through old lace curtains. Family is not a name, Henry. It's what you leave behind in people's hearts. And William's heart is too far gone. He nodded solemnly. Then I'll make it official. The foundation will be registered within the week. I'll handle the rest discreetly. Good, she said. And when you're done, send him a copy of the trust summary. Let him know his inheritance has been protected. Porter smiled faintly. Protected, yes. Just not for him. Eleanor gave a soft laugh, the kind that comes from strength rediscovered. Exactly. When she returned home that afternoon, Clara was waiting anxiously at the door. Well, she asked, her voice a mix of nerves and excitement. It's done, Eleanor said, her tone calm, almost serene. Gracewood now belongs to its true heirs, the ones who never asked for it. Clara sighed in relief, though her eyes glistened. You've really done it, haven't you? Outsmarted him at his own game. Eleanor walked toward the window, staring out across the fields. No, Clara, I didn't outsmart him. I just remembered who I am. I am his mother, the woman who taught him how to think. He only learned greed. I learned wisdom. The old clock in the hall chimed 3 times. The sound filled the house with a gentle finality, like the closing of a chapter. What if he finds out? Clara asked quietly. What if he tries to fight it? Eleanor smiled faintly. Then he'll learn one more lesson from me. That a mother's patience might fade, but her justice never will. That evening, William returned from town, his phone buzzing with restless notifications. Mother, he said, dropping his jacket onto the couch, I've arranged for us to meet Mr. Porter tomorrow. He'll help finalize the property adjustments. Eleanor looked up from her knitting, the picture of innocence. Oh, how thoughtful. Yes, he said, loosening his tie. He'll help us streamline the estate. Eleanor's expression didn't change. That's wonderful, dear. I actually visited him today myself. William froze mid-step. You did? Yes, we talked about my will, about Gracewood's future. His composure flickered for a fraction of a second, a tell she didn't miss. Oh, that's good. What did you decide? Eleanor smiled softly. You'll see soon enough. I wanted to make sure you're taken care of. The words soothed him instantly. His shoulders relaxed, his smile returned. That means a lot, Mother. I'm sure it does, she said. As he went upstairs, humming to himself, Eleanor watched him go, calm, unshaken. Clara stepped in from the hall. You told him? She whispered. Not what matters, Eleanor said quietly. Let him sleep in comfort tonight. Tomorrow the world will wake him. She turned back toward the window, where twilight draped the estate in deep gold. Her reflection in the glass was strong again, not the frail woman of a few weeks ago, but the Eleanor Grace who had once built an empire from dust. Justice, she murmured, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's written in ink and sealed with silence. Outside, the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon, and Gracewood stood bathed in shadow, the calm before revelation. The following morning arrived with sunlight so bright it seemed to mock the night's secrets. Birds darted across the pecan trees, their songs cutting through the still air like innocent laughter. Gracewood looked alive again, but Eleanor knew better. The house was not breathing new life. It was holding its breath. She sat at her writing desk, her tea untouched. William had gone into town early. She could tell by the faint hum of his car that he was restless, probably visiting the lawyer to finalize his victory. Let him go, she thought. Let him run straight into the truth. By mid-afternoon, she heard the car again. Tires crunching on gravel, doors slamming harder than they needed to. Then came the hurried footsteps. "Mother!" William's voice echoed through the hall. "Mother, where are you?" Eleanor looked up, composed herself, and called out softly. "In here." "Dear." He appeared at the doorway, face flushed, jaw tight. But his eyes, they carried something unfamiliar. Restraint. He forced a smile. "I saw Mr. Porter." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Oh, good. Then you must already know." His brow furrowed. "Know what?" "That everything is settled." He stepped inside, confusion sharpening into suspicion. "He told me you created some trust foundation. Said you transferred the estate." She nodded calmly. "That's right. The Gracewood Community Trust. It's what your father would have wanted." William's eyes darkened. "What my father would have wanted?" He repeated, his tone rising. "You've signed away our family land, to strangers, to charity." Eleanor didn't flinch. "To people who will cherish it, who'll preserve it, people who won't sell it for profit." He took a step closer, his voice trembling with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That land is worth millions. You can't just—" She interrupted softly. "I already did." The silence that followed was thick, vibrating. William's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You tricked me," he said finally, his tone low and bitter. "No," Eleanor replied evenly. "I protected what was never yours to take." He turned away, pacing. For a long moment, the only sound was his shoes against the hardwood floor. Then unexpectedly his voice softened. "Mother," he said, almost whispering. "I'm sorry." Eleanor's breath caught. "I've been selfish," he continued. "I let money blind me. I didn't see what mattered. You were right. Father worked himself to death for this place. I can't let that be in vain. I lost sight of things." He turned to her, eyes glistening, his face carefully arranged into remorse. "Give me a chance to make it right. Let me help manage the foundation. Please." Eleanor studied him in silence. Every instinct in her wanted to believe him. That maybe beneath all the greed, there was still a trace of the boy who once built forts under her dining table. But something in his tone didn't ring true. It was too quick, too polished, like a performance rehearsed in front of a mirror. "I'll think about it," she said carefully. "But these things take time." He nodded slowly, stepping closer. "That's all I ask?" He bent down and kissed her forehead. The first time he'd done that in years. The warmth of it almost broke her resolve. Almost. After he left the room, Clara stepped out from the hall where she'd been listening. Her brow was furrowed, suspicion plain on her face. "You don't believe him, do you?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, but I'll let him think I do. It's time to see how far he's willing to go." That night the mansion was quiet again. William lingered in the study long after dinner, pretending to read old business ledgers. Eleanor watched him from the doorway. His back was turned, his posture calm, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders. A man thinking too hard to be at peace. She approached slowly. "You're up late," she said softly. He looked over his shoulder. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind. The future, I suppose." He smiled faintly. "Always." She stepped closer. "You used to dream about the future differently. You once told me you'd build a bridge across the river, so people from both sides could visit Gracewood easily." He chuckled, nostalgic. "I remember that. I was 10. And I told you it was a lovely idea," she said. "A bridge that connects, not divides." He looked up at her then, eyes tired. I guess I forgot what that meant. Her expression softened. Maybe it's not too late to remember. He nodded, looking away. Maybe. But later that night, when she passed by his room, she saw the light under his door and heard faint whispers. His voice on the phone again, low, urgent, ruthless. Yes, the papers are filed, but she's still holding the power of attorney. I'll fix it tomorrow, don't worry. No, she doesn't suspect a thing. She's too sentimental to notice. Eleanor stood frozen, every word slicing deeper. The warmth she'd almost allowed to bloom turned to ash. When his door finally clicked shut, she went back to her study and wrote another entry in her diary. He's pretending repentance. But his greed runs deeper than guilt. Let him think he's winning. It will make the fall sharper. The next day, William played his part perfectly. He brought her breakfast in bed, eggs, toast, and coffee just the way she liked it. He asked about her health, offered to take her for a drive, even helped Clara trim the rose bushes outside. Eleanor watched it all quietly. He was good. Too good. The charm, the timing, the gentle tone, everything precisely measured to win back trust. After lunch, she noticed him walking toward her study. Her instincts sharpened. Quietly, she followed at a distance. Through the barely opened door, she saw him rifling through her drawers, searching. Her diary lay on the desk. He flipped through it quickly, stopping when he reached the pages about the will. Eleanor stepped forward, voice cold as winter steel. Looking for something, William? He spun around, startled. Mother, I was just checking to see if your apology worked? His mouth opened, then closed. The act was broken. Eleanor took a step closer. You may fool the world with your charm, but not me. I've seen that face too long. The only thing you ever loved was power. He straightened, anger flashing in his eyes. And you loved control. Don't act innocent. You ruled this family like a throne. You and Father both. Maybe I learned greed from the best. Eleanor's voice dropped. You learned everything except conscience. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two reflections of the same ambition, twisted by time. Then she spoke softly, the edge of sadness cutting through her calm. Leave the diary, William, and leave the room. He hesitated, then stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Clara entered moments later, face pale. You okay? Eleanor nodded faintly. Yes, he's nearly shown his hand. One more push, and he'll expose himself completely. She looked down at her trembling hands, then at the diary. Her eyes were calm again, her voice steady. Tomorrow, she whispered, the storm breaks. Morning came heavy and gray, as if the sky itself knew what was about to unfold. The wind stirred the magnolias outside, their leaves shivering in the stillness. Inside Gracewood, silence hung thick, a silence that always came before something broke. Eleanor sat in the drawing room, calm but alert. On the table beside her lay her diary, the one William had tried to read. Its pages were closed, locked with a small brass clasp. Next to it was a manila envelope marked, "To Mr. Henry Porter." Clara stood near the window, glancing nervously toward the drive. You sure about this, Miss Eleanor? Eleanor nodded. He's trapped himself, Clara. I just need him to admit it, in his own words. And how exactly are you planning to make that happen? Eleanor looked up, her gaze steady. By giving him what he thinks he wants. William entered without knocking, his footsteps brisk, his voice already defensive. Mother, we need to talk. Eleanor smiled faintly. Of course we do. Sit down. He hesitated, then sat opposite her. His jaw was tight. His cufflinks gleamed. I've been thinking, she began softly. And perhaps I was too hasty with the trust. His eyes flickered, a spark of greed lighting instantly. What do you mean? Maybe I acted out of emotion. Maybe it wasn't fair to you. After all, you've worked hard too. He leaned forward, eager. I have, Mother. Everything I've done for this family, for Gracewood. Eleanor tilted her head. Of course. And you'd take care of it if it were yours? He placed a hand over his heart. You know I would. I'd protect it, expand it, make it something the world would remember. She smiled gently. Then perhaps it's time we revisit the paperwork. His breath caught. You mean, I'll call Mr. Porter this afternoon, she said smoothly. We'll review the documents, perhaps restore things as they were. William exhaled, his relief visible. Mother, that means more than you know. I promise you, this is the right decision. Eleanor's voice softened. I'm sure it is. But before I do, I need to know something. He frowned. What's that? She leaned closer. If the land was yours, what would you do with it? He smiled, confidently, foolishly. I'd develop it. Build new homes, maybe even a golf resort. The Grove alone could turn into a small fortune. We could partner with investors, turn this place into a legacy worth remembering. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. And the people who live on that land now? He shrugged. They'd be compensated. Progress has to move forward, Mother. You taught me that. No, she said quietly. I taught you to build, not destroy. Her tone sliced through the room. The warmth drained from William's smile. What are you getting at? He asked. Eleanor leaned back, calm as ever. I'm getting at the truth. The same truth you whispered into your phone 2 nights ago. The one about transferring ownership and liquidating the orchard. William froze. You were listening? No, she said, her eyes steady. I was recording. He went pale. What? Eleanor nodded toward the far corner of the room, where Clara stood silently beside a small voice recorder. Its red light blinked faintly, steady and accusing. William shot to his feet. You can't do that. Oh, but I already have. Eleanor's voice was calm, almost pitying. Every word, every plan, every lie. It's all right there. Enough to prove your intent to defraud this family and its assets. He laughed, a sharp, broken sound. You wouldn't dare use that against your own son. I wouldn't have to, she said, reaching for the envelope. Mr. Porter will. He already has instructions. If anything happens to me, this recording goes straight to him, and to the police. For a moment, William said nothing. The room seemed smaller now, the air tighter. His face twisted, rage, fear, and disbelief mixing into something ugly. You planned this, he said through clenched teeth. All of it, Eleanor's voice softened. You planned it first, William. I just finished it. He paced, his composure cracking. You think this makes you noble? You're ruining everything. You're handing our family's future to strangers. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. No, son, I'm saving it from one. He turned sharply toward Clara. And you helped her? Clara didn't flinch. Every step of the way. William's breath came faster. He looked like a man cornered by ghosts. The ghosts of conscience and consequence. You're both insane, Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. If protecting what's sacred makes me insane, then I'll wear that proudly. He glared at her, eyes blazing. You'll regret this. No, William, she said softly. You will? She reached for her diary, opened it to a marked page, and began reading aloud. If love becomes greed, and greed becomes cruelty, then truth must become the cure, even if it hurts the one you love most. Her voice shook slightly at the last line, but her resolve didn't. William stared at her, the woman he thought was fragile, powerless, dying, and for the first time, he saw something he couldn't control, her strength. He turned without another word, storming out of the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hall like thunder receding into distance. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her hand trembling only slightly. Clara placed a comforting palm on her shoulder. He'll come back, Clara murmured. Men like him always do, Eleanor nodded slowly. Let him. When he does, he'll find nothing left to take. That evening, the sun dipped behind the grove, casting long shadows across the fields. Eleanor stood on the veranda, the wind lifting her gray hair. She watched as William's car disappeared down the dirt road, a dark shape swallowed by twilight. Beside her, Clara handed her the voice recorder. What do we do with it now? Eleanor smiled faintly. Keep it safe. One day it'll remind him what happens when love is treated like currency. She turned her gaze to the land. Her land. The same soil that had raised her family, tested her faith, and now, finally, delivered justice. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The house behind her was still, but not empty. It was peaceful, protected. Justice doesn't always roar, she whispered. Sometimes it just breathes quietly after the storm. The days that followed were quiet. Not the uneasy silence of waiting, but the calm that comes after truth has done its work. Gracewood no longer felt haunted. The halls, though still old and heavy with history, seemed lighter now. The walls that once echoed with unspoken words now held peace. Eleanor moved slower these days, but not from frailty. It was a different kind of stillness, the kind that follows when the heart finally sets something down it has carried too long. Clara often found her by the veranda, gazing out across the fields, a soft smile tracing her lips. The pecan trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches alive with birds that had returned to nest. Life was moving forward as it always did. Coffee, Miss Eleanor? Clara asked one morning. Yes, please, Eleanor said, her voice light. And bring another cup. You should sit too. Clara raised a brow. Sit? With you? That's new, Eleanor chuckled. I've spent too many years talking to people who didn't listen. I'd rather talk to someone who does. Clara smiled, poured the coffee, and joined her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sunlight stretched across the porch, painting their faces in gold. Finally, Clara asked what had been sitting heavy in her mind for days. Do you think he'll come back? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked out at the long dirt road that led from the gate to the highway. He will, she said softly. But not for what he lost. For what he can't replace. And what's that? My forgiveness, she said simply. A week later, the letter came. It was postmarked from Atlanta, written in William's neat, controlled handwriting. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't afraid of what it might say. She just wanted a second to breathe in the quiet, to remember who she was before every word was about business, property, or betrayal. Finally, she unfolded the paper. Mother, I don't know what to say that would matter now. You've made your point, and I've lost everything I thought I was fighting for. When I left, I told myself I hated you for what you did. But the truth is, I hate myself for making you do it. You were right. Greed blinded me. I thought control meant love. I thought power meant protection. But all it did was hollow me out. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I just hope someday when you walk those fields, you'll think of me without anger. Maybe then I'll have earned something money could never buy. William Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her diary, between the pages that held her tears, her doubts, and her final resolve. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe you finally built that bridge after all, my son." Later that afternoon, Mr. Porter arrived, hat in hand, his usual brisk manner softened by the sight of her. "You look better, Eleanor," he said. "There's a kind of light about you these days." She smiled faintly. "Peace does that to people." He nodded and took a seat. "I came to tell you the trust is officially active. The Gracewood Community Foundation is legally in operation. The land, the estate, the funds, all secured. You've done something remarkable." Eleanor looked out the window, where a group of children from the local school were walking along the edge of the property, laughing as they pointed at the trees. "No," she said. "We've done something right," Porter chuckled. "You know, it's rare I see justice work out cleanly in my line of work. Usually it's messy. Someone always loses." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Everyone loses something, Henry. But if the right lesson is learned, then nothing's wasted." He nodded, quietly impressed. "And what's the lesson here, if you don't mind me asking?" She smiled, her voice carrying both sorrow and grace. "That love without honesty turns into poison, and that forgiveness, even when it's earned too late, is still worth giving." That evening, when the sun began to sink, Eleanor asked Clara to drive her down to the grove. The air smelled of sweetgrass and damp soil. The ground, wet from last night's rain, shimmered like glass in the fading light. They stopped by the old family graves, weathered stones surrounded by wild flowers. Charles' name was carved deep into one of them, strong and sure. She knelt beside it, brushing away the leaves. "Do you see now?" she whispered. "It took everything we built to teach him what you and I already knew, that love without loyalty isn't love at all." The wind moved softly through the trees, almost like a sigh in reply. Clara stood a few steps behind, giving her space. The sunset caught the edges of Eleanor's hair, turning it silver and gold all at once. After a while, Eleanor rose, steady but slow. "Let's go home," she said. As they drove back, the mansion came into view, bathed in orange light, proud and alive again. Children from the village were playing by the old fence, their laughter spilling through the evening air. The sound was pure, bright, and free. Eleanor smiled. "That's the sound of Gracewood's new owners," she said softly. That night, she wrote her final entry in the diary. "Today, the land feels lighter. The house no longer mourns. Justice has been done not by punishment but by truth. I have learned that revenge without mercy leaves only ashes, but justice with compassion leaves legacy. William may never walk these halls again, but his soul will. I have forgiven him, because love that refuses to forgive becomes another kind of greed." She closed the diary gently and set it beside the letter. Before she went to bed, she walked once more through the halls, touching the banister, the portraits, the piano where her son once plucked notes with chubby fingers. Each step was a goodbye and a beginning at once. Outside, the moon was rising, full and soft, spilling light over the grove. The house glowed quietly beneath it, standing proud against the dark. Eleanor paused at her bedroom door, whispering into the stillness, "Good night, Charles." "Good night, Gracewood, and good night, my son. You finally came home, not in wealth, but in truth." She turned out the light, and the mansion settled into silence. Not an empty silence this time, but peace. The kind that comes only after justice and love have shaken hands. The end.